and welcome to episode 5 of the Snare Drum Virtuoso podcast. My name is Jonathan Curtis, and at the beginning there, we were just hearing an excerpt from one of my pieces entitled Attainment. This is from the Meditations collection, Snare Drum Compositions Volume 2, and it features the snare drum accompanied by this wonderful tam-tam, which is kind of like a big gong cymbal, which I shouldn't really say because it's kind of a faux pas to confuse a tam-tam with a gong. But nevertheless, imagine a giant gong, and it produces this wonderful acoustic drone, and it was also accompanied by a bass drum and the wood blocks there. Now, before we go any further, we're going to listen to another piece in full this time, but it's only a short one. This is from the Nard collection, America's Drum Solos. This is a traditional American rudimental piece entitled 2/4 Hooker by Fred Miller, just to give us a bit of contrast from that more contemporary piece we were just listening to. So before we go any further, let's enjoy the entire short, sharp piece that is 2/4 Hooker by Fred Miller. Now, if you like what you are hearing in these podcasts, you are more than welcome to come and explore my website. Visit my website, jonathancurtis.co.uk. Here you will find all of the information about me, my publications, my compositions, my educational work, my lessons, internationally, online, and locally in the studio, and access to a wealth of instructional and performance and compositional based YouTube videos at my YouTube channel, /JCurtisDrums. Or just come along and say hello. It would be lovely to hear from you. Now, today I'm going to be discussing the topic of stages of progression when learning a musical instrument. I'm lucky enough to work with many students. Over the years, I've worked with hundreds of students of all levels and abilities, and of course, have been and continue to be a student myself on the path to mastery. The aspiration to master my craft is very strong and something that I pursue on a daily basis, which is why I love talking about it and researching it and writing things and doing things and practicing. Now, last time, episode 4, I talked in great detail about the idea of practicing. But today I want to take a slightly more conceptual look at the idea of progression and ultimately mastery. Now, I'm going to broadly break down the progression today into 3 main parts. And there are a few subparts in there, but there are 3 main categories that I'm going to talk about. The first category is being a student. The second category is being an expert, and the third category is being a master. Now, I should hasten to add here that these are by no means official or universally accepted definitions, nor are they clean cut. I'm just using these terms to divide and describe broad stages of development in a conceptual way. So don't read too much into the labeling here, but it can be helpful from a conceptual level, from an analytical point of view, to talk about broad categories. So the stage of being a student, the stage of being an expert, and the stage of being a master. But as I said, the lines are very blurred and the definitions are by no means clear, or, if we're being honest, necessarily meaningful. It doesn't ultimately matter what we label ourselves or what we label others. One thing that I think is really important to me as an earnest practitioner of an art form is one's contribution to that art form at whatever level it may be. I think even beginner students can make meaningful and worthwhile contributions to the art form. It has no bearing on their ability or renown or status or past work. I think an erstwhile contribution is a valid one, but we'll come to this. So, what am I talking about? What are these broad strokes with which I am painting? To begin with then, the idea of being a student. And I'm going to talk a little bit about these stages as being broadly separated by what we might consider a threshold. But as I say, this threshold is blurred and not necessarily clean cut. So we begin with the first stage, And again, before I get started, lots of disclaimers here today. These are just based on my own observations. As I say, there is nothing academic or official about this. This is just my own observation, working with myself, of course, and with hundreds of students over the years. So we begin with being a student. And the idea of being a student is, of course, all about learning as much as we can from nothing. And I think this is one of the key ideas here. When we first start learning a skill, when we first start learning the snare drum or the drum kit or a musical instrument, we come from nothing, essentially. If I were to go to somebody for violin lessons, I would be day one, lesson one, page one of the first book, right? I know absolutely nothing about playing the violin, aside from the fact it's got 4 strings and you use frets and a bow. That's about it. So I know absolutely nothing about the act of playing a violin. So I would be starting from zero, and a teacher would gradually fill in my understanding from the bottom up. They would build my foundational understanding, teach me the core concepts and techniques, teach me some pieces, and I would gradually form my own understanding. And as I progressed, my confidence would grow, my knowledge base would grow, my ability, my technical prowess would all improve, and I would progress through the stages of being a student. Now, traditionally, we talk about 3 stages of being a student: being a beginner, being an intermediate, and being an advanced. And again, these don't necessarily mean anything, but they can be a convenient way to talk about conventional stages of progression. For instance, if my wife sees one of my students leaving my studio, maybe it's a new student or somebody that's just visiting for a one-off lesson, she might say, "Oh, what stage was your student at?" And I might say, "Oh, she's really advanced." Or I might say she's a complete beginner. It gives some indication, right? It gives some information, even if we don't have any clear definition of what beginner or advanced really means. And many students worry, I think, that they get trapped into the intermediate middle. Many students stay or fear that they are stalling in this perpetual state of mediocrity, stalling in the intermediate stage, and never daring to claim that they have achieved this advanced level. So what does this all really mean, and what might these stages look like? Well, being a beginner is the easiest to define. Being a beginner, as I've said, essentially means you're coming from nothing, and you and your teacher are trying to build a solid foundation covering all of the fundamentals. So on the snare drum, for instance, we want to include general understanding of rhythm and meter, maybe notational reading, techniques, grip, the basic rudiments and figures and phrases that we play, starting with some really simple pieces and repertoire. Anything to introduce the student to the instrument as a whole, to engage them, and to put them on specific paths. For instance, I believe anybody wishing to learn the snare drum should have a good understanding of not only the 40 essential rudiments, but a conceptual understanding of what that means, what they are, which I've, of course, talked about at great length in other episodes of this podcast. But I believe that is a fundamental tenet of learning to play the snare drum. Indeed, I believe so strongly in this that I don't think it is possible to even play the snare drum without the rudiments. But anyway, I don't want to start repeating myself here. Nevertheless, that would be something that I would start with a complete beginner. Yes, I'd get them talking and thinking and practicing basic motions and stroke types and things, but I would get them thinking about the rudiments as a concept, as an idea, as a body of vocabulary and ideas. This is just a fundamental idea. And being a beginner also means taking the tentative steps through things that are, at first, very, very difficult, right? It is really unintuitive to play a paradiddle or a double stroke roll. Many people can hit a drum. It doesn't take any skill to hit a drum, but it can be really disconcerting the first time you're faced with a particular sticking pattern, because unless you have some very particular skills in other areas, it's unlikely you've had to coordinate your hands in that way. Likewise, if you're playing a guitar, you have to learn to coordinate your hands, with one doing these strange chord shapes and the other trying to pick or pluck or strum particular strings. So the idea of being a beginner is very much one of being a newborn lamb, right? Taking your first tentative, stumbling, clumsy steps as a hopefully qualified teacher guides you in the right direction, gives you feedback. And this, I think, is probably the most fundamental characteristic of the beginner stage, which is the complete dependence on the teacher. A beginner simply lacks the experience and the time and the engagement and the depth of knowledge to answer the questions they may have themselves. Whether that question be about the notes they're seeing on a page, theory. Maybe it's about how to hold the stick, how to perform a stroke, some weird thing they're encountering in their left hand. Whatever it may be, a beginner is simply not equipped to try and answer that question themselves. There is no confidence and there is no body of knowledge that allows them to answer that question. So I think the defining characteristic of the beginner is this complete and utter dependence on the teacher, which is why it's so important, I think, for beginners, in fact, any students, let's face it, but beginners especially, to start off with a good teacher. I think this is why people should be very careful about who they choose to teach them. But nevertheless, I digress. This dependence on the teacher is such that, as I say, the beginner is just not equipped to tackle the problems they face on their own. Now, as we progress through this, as we progress to a more intermediate level, this starts to change. The dependence is less on the teacher and more on the need for guidance. And I think this is a subtle but important distinction. When you are a beginner, or let's flip it around, when I am teaching a beginner and they trust me, which is a really big responsibility, but if I have this trusting beginner in front of me and it's my job to teach them the drums, they basically do what I say. Now, I don't mean that to sound authoritative or anything like that, but that's just the nature of the relationship for the beginner drummer. Yes, they are welcome to state preferences of things they want to learn, and they can ask questions, of course, and we can have a discussion. But essentially, for them to progress safely, if you like, and efficiently through the beginner stage, they basically need to do what I tell them to do. That's essentially it. If that's the long and the short of it. I will set them certain pieces, certain exercises, certain things to practice, get them listening to certain things and exploring certain ideas, because they simply need to take on board as much as they can of this new art form that is completely unfamiliar to them. Whereas this changes somewhat when you become an intermediate drummer, or as I say, when faced with an intermediate student. It is no longer necessarily the case of me telling them what to do, but it's more often me shoving them in the right direction, pointing them in the right direction, and then giving them something of a forceful push. Because a decent intermediate student will hopefully have a firm grasp of the fundamentals. They will understand if I ask them how time signatures work. They will understand how rhythm works, and they will understand how notation works on the page. That doesn't mean they're flawless or fluent in sight reading, right? No, of course not. But they have the concepts. They have the understanding of the basic idea. So a through and through intermediate student will be able to play. They will be able to play along to music. They will be able to keep time, again, not flawlessly, but they will be able to keep time dependably, stably. And they will have a firm grasp of the fundamental techniques. And if I ask them to show me various things, they should at least have some idea of what I'm asking them, rather than looking at me blankly. And they should be able to demonstrate a relatively clear degree of autonomy, which again, this comes down to the main characteristic, one of the main ideas I'm talking about here. So as I said, I think the defining characteristic of being a beginner is this utter dependence on the teacher. As we become intermediates, I think the dependency becomes more on the guidance. As I say, there becomes a higher level, there arises a higher level of autonomy, where the student has a better idea of what they're doing, how to do it, and I think crucially a better idea of what they want as well. Now, I'll come on to this idea a little bit later on, but I think an intermediate player will start to realize the sheer enormity of the task at hand. Beginners have a degree of naivety about what's to come, where they know they don't know anything about an instrument, but they don't know the depths of it. And it always makes me smile when I see the various revelations from students at various stages of their journey, when they encounter something that absolutely kicks the bottom out of the well. They thought they were standing at the bottom, and then they realize they've only just entered, and the depths beneath them are quite frightening. Or, for some, quite exciting as well, which is quite nice. But nevertheless, I think as you enter the intermediate stage, you start to see the enormity of the art form, and you become very aware of what you don't know. You become very aware of what you can't do, and all of the things that is available out there, all of the different styles and techniques and genres and concepts and ideas and bands and everything else. You suddenly start to go, wow, I know nothing. And that's a really important stage to get to, this idea of seeing the enormity of an art form. But nevertheless, intermediate students, of course, still have a dependency on the teacher, but that relationship changes somewhat. So intermediate students need direction. They need help with resources. Where do I go to look for this? How do I do this particular part? But for instance, if I think of one of my let's say grade 4 students on the drum kit, if I put an appropriately leveled piece in front of them, they don't need me to stand there with a pencil going through it with them note for note. They will be able to look at it and start to work it out for themselves. And they will have questions. They will say, what does that mean? But what they lack, and this is kind of where we start to get onto the idea of advanced playing, but what they will lack is this idea of the conceptual meaning behind what they are playing. So, for instance, we might come across a figure in this piece that is based on paradiddle diddles, for example. Now, a generally competent intermediate student will probably spot that they're paradiddle diddles, but they won't really understand why. They won't really understand the application or the intention from the composer. They won't really understand the reasoning or the gravity of the fact that it's a paradiddle diddle, because from a composer's perspective, that paradiddle diddle is there for a reason. Now, I can't necessarily say what that reason is. I have my own reasons for why I would use one, but whatever the composer was thinking at the time has gone into deciding why that paradiddle diddle was used, as opposed to, say, a double paradiddle or just a single stroke roll. Now, an intermediate player will not necessarily grasp the deeper reasoning, the intention of the composer, or the deeper compositional elements. For example, I will see students who recognize that a particular fill is based on a paradiddle, but that paradiddle might be in 12/8. So we get this polyrhythmic effect. So they've recognized there's a difficult section whereby a paradiddle, a grouping of 4, is played in a 6-note subdivision, for example, but they won't have grasped the fact that this was done to accommodate or produce a polyrhythm. So this idea of conceptual understanding, I think, comes a little bit later on. But nevertheless, they will know enough to spot the sticking pattern. They will know enough to spot the fact that the sticking pattern doesn't match the subdivision and that there's some kind of metric wizardry going on. But there is still this need for guidance and a firm shove and an explanation of concept here. Now, as we start to get into the advanced level, and again, the key element here is just time and engagement and experience, we start to get much more of a self-dependence, what we call autodidactic learning, where the advanced player is very much able, or I should say the advanced student is very much able to direct themselves. They have a strong grasp of the fundamentals. They have a strong grasp of the instrument on a base level. They're starting to develop a good conceptual understanding. But it's the last stages of true dependence on the teacher. But the relationship here is a really interesting one. It becomes something more like the way a doctor works. When you go to a doctor, you don't just say, "Make me better, please." You describe symptoms, and the doctor uses their knowledge and expertise to consider the symptoms and then to diagnose and then prescribe. So if I go to the doctor with X, Y, and Z, they may say this is consistent with this particular ailment, and here's what you should do about it. And it's the same way with advanced students. When I get advanced students visiting me, they don't need me to teach them how to play a paradiddle. They don't need me even to teach them how to play the song they're working on or the piece they're learning, But what they might say is, I'm having trouble with getting this technique to work for me. I'm having trouble producing this effect, or I'm having trouble with this section, or I don't understand what's going on here. So there is a symptom. And it is my job with the advanced student to diagnose and then prescribe, as I say. So we might look at why they don't understand it, and some things they're missing on a conceptual level, some mistakes they're making on a technical level, and then I can prescribe what they do next. Think about this, practice this, work on this, consider this. And then over the course of time, they will fix these issues. And it has been my job simply to perform as a doctor would, to diagnose and prescribe. And I think this really marks the final stages of the student phase. Now, that doesn't mean you stop being a student. I think even the best drummers in the world benefit and continue to attend lessons with people they trust for specific reasons or for specific purposes. Again, I will come on to that later. But this idea of dependence on the teacher, I think, starts to wane a lot when we get to the advanced stages. Now, the advanced moniker, the terminology here, can be quite ill-informed. It can be quite deceptive, because we might look, at least in the UK, we might look at the grading system, for example, and we might look at somebody who is a grade 8 drummer, and we might say, oh, well, if they're a grade 8, they must be advanced. Well, yes, there is a degree of that. You are unlikely to attain a grade 8 if you are not sufficiently advanced. But that in and of itself does not guarantee ability. It does not guarantee understanding. It does guarantee that the student has performed to a certain level in an exam environment and been judged by an assessor that they have reached this level. But what happens, for example, if a grade 8 student is 12 years old and has never been on stage? They've got their grade 8, right? They've got the certificate, and maybe they even performed really well and they got a distinction on their certificate. But if they've never been on stage, they've never performed with other musicians, they've never improvised, they've never done X, Y, and Z, they've simply not been alive long enough to absorb enough information, how could we say that they're an advanced player, even though they've got the certificate that supposedly proves it? So I think achieving this level of advanced student is far more than just attaining a certain grade and far more than ticking some arbitrary boxes. I'm thinking of some of my own grade 8 students here, and I by no means wish to diminish their achievements. They've earned their certificate and they've earned their grade 8. But when you are young, as I've said, you simply haven't been alive long enough to absorb enough information, to get different perspectives, and to gain the experience required to progress to that advanced stage. So there is still quite a high degree of dependence on me as their teacher. Whereas, to flip that round, I know of students who I would consider advanced, where our lessons involve mainly discussing concept, right? Mainly discussing ideas and going through problematic pieces and things like this. And they don't have a grade 8. They've never taken a grade in their life, but they are usually older adults, if not young adults, full-blown adults or middle-aged or something like that, where they've got a vast array of experience behind them. But they nevertheless need a bit of guidance, as I say, in this doctor relationship with the teacher. So the advanced level of student can be quite difficult. It can be quite difficult to navigate, which is why I think so few students are willing to consider themselves advanced. And I think this again brings with it a degree of awareness of just how much they don't know. We often talk about this valley of despair when learning an instrument. You start very strongly, right? From nothing, you can only go upwards. So you start learning quite quickly. Imagine it like plotting on a graph. It's going up and up and up, but then you start to plateau. And then you take a sharp downwards turn as you suddenly start to encounter things that are more difficult, and you become very, very aware of how much further you've got to go and how little you've done so far. And then you spend what seems like the rest of your artistic life climbing out of this valley again as you very slowly start to cover the ground and you very slowly start to see yourself making progress. But I think even advanced students are still only just climbing out of this trough on the graph, because this brings me to the first major stepping stone, which is that threshold that takes a student from the student phase into what I might call the expert phase. Now, I've actually talked about this stage before. I recently co-authored and edited a book with a good friend and colleague of mine called Paul Hose. The book's called The Creative Practitioner, and it's generally involved with professionalizing an art form, those looking to start a business as an artist, to monetize their art form. But within that book, there are chapters when we talk about subject knowledge and the act of practicing and mastery and things like this. And I talk about, this was one of the sections that I contributed, talking about this stage, and I called it at the time the imitate, innovate line, this threshold that we can broadly describe any musician. I'll limit it to musicians for now because I'm not qualified to talk about other skill sets, but we can broadly divide musicians into being before this stage or after this stage. And I think it can also be described as this threshold I'm talking about between student and expert. We can call it, as I say, imitate and innovate. And the broad idea is this. When you are before this line, in what I've previously called the imitate phase, you are learning how to do something and you are imitating doing something. So when I have a student who is before this stage, in the imitate stage, when I put on, let's say, a jazz play-along track and I say, let's play some jazz, and I ask them to play along, even if they are a relatively advanced student and they've got some ability and coordination and understanding and they play along, they are essentially imitating the art form. They are imitating playing jazz because they are still in the process of learning it. They are not jazz musicians, quote unquote. They are students learning how to play jazz by imitating and trying to sound like what they are told a jazz drummer should sound like. So I will be giving them feedback, try to do more of this, think more of this, listen to this, and they will be trying to adjust their imitation to fall more in line with the direction I'm pushing them towards. And being before this line, being before this threshold, it can be very difficult to imagine what it feels like to be on the other side, this idea of breaching this threshold and passing through to the innovate stage. Now, the difference here, I think, it can be difficult to describe and define, but the difference, I think, is when you are on the other side of this line, when you've breached this line, you are not imitating playing jazz drums, you are playing jazz drums, right? So if I have been hired to play with a jazz trio and we go to a jazz club and we play an evening of jazz, I'm not like the student in my studio playing along to a John Riley bop piece and trying to play jazz. I am actually playing jazz. I'm making an earnest contribution to the musical landscape of jazz music. And I'm doing it for real. And I don't just mean this to be, well, I'm on stage in front of an audience rather than I'm in a studio. I mean, it's the sense of confidence and performance. I actually know what I'm doing, right? Hypothetically, right? And I'm not sure any of us know what we're doing with jazz, but nevertheless, I digress. I know what I'm doing, right? I know what's expected of me by the rest of the band. I know enough about the art form to play. I know enough how to synergize with the rest of the band. I know enough about the genre, characteristics, stylistic points and idioms and things like this. I'm not just practicing jazz from a book. I am performing jazz for real. And this is quite an ineffable thing to describe. Whereas for the student, even the most advanced student, they are not at that stage yet. But I think when you breach this threshold, it brings with it this sense of confidence and arrival that is very hard to talk about for those that haven't achieved it yet. And it doesn't necessarily happen overnight, right? I don't think you suddenly learn something and go, bingo, that's it, I've arrived. I think it's a slow process, but you start to realize that you know what you're doing. You start to realize that you have the confidence to answer your own questions. Right back at the beginning when I was talking about the beginner student, I talked about being completely unequipped to answer any questions or tackle any issues that they encounter. Whereas when you've breached this threshold into what I've called the expert stage, it doesn't mean you know everything, but it means you fully understand how to go about finding the answer. So As I've said, if I find something on my music stand and I go, what on earth is that? I don't need to book a lesson with a teacher. I can figure it out. And I know how to figure it out. I have the tools, I have the understanding, I have the past connections that I can draw upon in terms of my understanding and experience to go, okay, I see what's going on here. I understand the concept. I understand the application. I understand what the composer's trying to get me to do. I understand why it's being used, and now I just can't do it. No, I just need to practice it, right? And likewise, I think in terms of anything we may encounter on the drums, whether that's playing a different style, whether that's taking a gig or a professional contract. And again, I don't think this implies ability. I don't think this means that the expert drummer can somehow magically play everything that's put in front of them. But they have enough understanding and experience to be able to get there and figure it out and do the job. So again, if I take myself as an example, if I were hired to play with, let's say, a Latin jazz band or a jazz band that did a lot of Latin work. Now, I am by no means a master Latin player on the drum kit, but my experience and my ability, what Vinny Colaiuta really wonderfully called his acquired facility. I love that phrase. My acquired facility on the drum kit is enough that I would be perfectly content to take that job and to play with that band and to do a good job. Now, it by no means follows that I would sound like Horatio Hernandez, right? That I would, or Tito Puente or something, where I'm playing these wonderfully virtuoso Latin performances, authentic Latin performances with unbelievable coordination and claves on every toe and things like this. But it does mean that I have this confident presence where I can at least do the job. I would be confident in figuring it out, listening, following, and achieving what I needed to achieve. Now, people coming away from that gig may say, yeah, the drummer was pretty solid there, or they may say, wow, he absolutely nailed it. But it's unlikely that I'm going to absolutely botch the job, right? I have enough acquired facility that I know I can do the job. And I think achieving this level of expertise is where most working musicians find themselves. And ironically, I think they get there through being a professional musician. I think many professional musicians, when they first start out, feel like imposters. You have this imposter syndrome, and they worry about their own ability and things like this, and can I do this job? What if I mess it up? And things like this, where it's actually the act of doing it and acquiring that experience that pushes them firmly into the expertise stage. Now, when I look back at my own journey, I look back 10, 15 years ago at my first ever gig, and I was an advanced enough drummer that playing what I had to play was no problem. I was good enough to actually play the drums to the required level, but what I lacked was experience, which meant I lacked confidence, I lacked stage presence, I lacked knowledge and understanding of how to conduct myself. These days, I've faced everything you could face on a stage. I've had hi-hats collapse. I've had monitors stop working. I've dropped sticks. I've played the wrong intro to a song. I've played in one-time signature while the band have been in. Everything you can think of that could go wrong for a live musician, I've done or I've had happen to me at some point. And these days, when I go on stage, there might be a few nerves, but essentially I don't have any fear. I'm perfectly confident that I can handle whatever might happen. If the in-ear monitors fail, I can take one of them out and listen with my other ear. If I drop a stick, I can pick it up and carry on. I can keep the beat with one hand. It doesn't really matter. I have this awareness, this confidence, and of course, this wonderful phrase, acquired facility, that I know I can get through the gig. But I've arrived at that stage because of the experience of having done that. Those times when something did happen to me on the stage where I didn't know how to handle it, where I had to play a song that I just couldn't play, where someone called a foxtrot and started playing and I had no idea what a foxtrot was. That experience, ironically, is what really forces you to get to that stage. So I suppose we can pause here and we can ask the question, can you achieve a level of expertise by practice alone? Or does expertise require, let's say, performing on a stage? Well, in a sense, yes, I think it does. I don't think that means you have to be a professional, and I don't think it means you have to be this touring musician. But there is a limit to what you can achieve in the practice room. Now, that limit may not be on ability. As I said, talking about the bedroom guitarist earlier, you can achieve incredible technical feats, never leaving your bedroom, never leaving your studio, hell, never even leaving the pad. But this process, unfortunately, lacks the experience of doing it for real. So you never breach that line of imitate to innovate. You are always in your studio pretending to play jazz, then actually out there with other musicians playing jazz. Now, again, that doesn't mean you have to be on a grand stage with world-class players for it to count. It might just be a local pub where a load of musicians get together on a Wednesday evening for an amateur jazz group. That's where I started out, jam sessions and things like that. But it was that exposure of encountering things that you can't encounter in the practice room. So, for example, I might be playing jazz with one of these jazz groups, and the saxophonist who's taking a solo is a bar out, and the rhythm section looks at each other and realizes that the saxophonist is in the wrong place in the arrangement. And you deal with that. You communicate with each other and you figure it out. Maybe you drop a bar and you all agree with some form of magical non-verbal communication to come back in where the saxophonist thinks they are rather than where the band actually should be. Now, that's a learning experience. That's something that you can't experience in the practice room. That's something you can't fake. Because if you're playing along to a play-along track, you are either in time with it or you're not. And if you're not, it's your fault, because the play-along track is infallible, essentially, right? It's to a click, it's a recording, it's the same every time. Whereas when you're playing with a live band, you have so many factors to contend with that you learn to listen for things, nuances, and little pieces of understanding that you just can't get anywhere else. So yes, I think there is a requirement, if not playing on a stage, at least exposure with playing with other musicians. And I don't think you can realistically realistically expect to achieve a degree of expertise until you have done that to quite a high degree. There are very few skills out there that I can think of where expertise is gained through just practice alone. Obviously, practice can go a long, long way. But if I think about my career again, I'm surrounded here as I record this in my studio where I've spent countless hours practicing. The countless hours practicing have been incredibly valuable for my ability, my, what's the phrase? Acquired facility, and my confidence with my hands and things like that. But that's not where I progressed the most. Where I progressed the most was my time touring and playing live shows and in the studio with other musicians and out there doing it for real. So I really don't think you can understate. No, I don't think you can overstate how important that is. Now, achieving this degree of expertise is, I think, where most, as I say, professional musicians are, and that's a great place to be. I think of a lot of my colleagues and friends who work as professional musicians, and I would consider all of them experts because they have been doing it a long time and they would be perfectly willing and able to accept and tackle any job that I gave them or anybody else gave them. And I think about, for example, students I worked with. In fact, at the very beginning of this episode, the people playing with me on Attainment, we were listening to the excerpt at the very beginning, the three accompanists were all students of varying levels. Now, I think they were all graduates, they were ex-students, but they were, two of them at least, I believe, were recent students, recent graduates from a conservatoire. But they were in their 20s, and throughout their student life, they had been on stage countless times. They'd done assignments, they'd done work placements in orchestras and all sorts of things that they were very certainly, even if they were at the beginning of it in some cases, they were in this expertise phase where they weren't dependent on me to tell them what to do. I was able to give them the material, say, learn this, and they knew, and it was implied that I expected them to know, things like professional decorum, punctuality, how to conduct yourself in a studio, how your equipment works, being responsible for your own equipment, being responsible for your own parts, how to work with a metronome, how to work with in-ear monitors, and all these things that are assumed that go far beyond what you can just practice, right? So again, this is what I'm talking about, real-world experience. If I've hired somebody to record on one of my projects, I know that I can't babysit them, and they know that they don't need babysitting. If they need babysitting, I'm unlikely to work with them because it just won't work. That's not the nature of the project. So I think this idea of expertise brings with it a whole raft of understanding and knowledge and experience and confidence in so much more than just the act of playing. As I say, I expect people who work with me, I'm paying them a lot of money. I expect them to know how their equipment works, and I expect them to choose appropriate equipment for the job, and I expect them to understand the nuances of the genres we're playing or whatever it may be, right? And this is all accounted for in this broad swathe of expertise. And I think this stage of expertise is where most musicians in the world find themselves, if they stick with it. I think when you find these people who talk with great knowledge and experience about how to do things, maybe they're teachers, maybe they're performers, professionals, touring musicians, whatever it may be, I think ultimately, as long as you stick with it and you persist and you get out and have experience and give it enough time, I think all musicians eventually end up in this expertise stage, because you can't not with enough accumulated knowledge and experience, as I say. But really, where does mastery come into this? Because expertise is the penultimate stage I've talked about so far. And I think mastery is the most fascinating stage of all. And I think, again, as between the student stage, even the most advanced student, and the experts, there's this threshold between expertise and mastery. I think there's a threshold that, again, you don't necessarily know when you've progressed through it until you look back, or maybe it's just something somebody else applies to you. I think there are a few traits with genuine masters that include humility. So I don't think genuine masters would describe themselves as such, ironically. But nevertheless, I think there is this threshold to mastery that sets them apart from what we might call mere expertise. And it's very difficult, again, to describe what that stage is or what that threshold is. But I think one of the defining features of mastery is further accumulated knowledge and experience and ability, of course, but also a degree of specialization. I don't think mastery can exist on a broad front. I think if you imagine a teacher who you would trust to teach you anything you needed, and they seem to have a wealth of knowledge on anything you ask them about, I think that's displaying a very broad and deep level of expertise. Whereas mastery, I think, requires a degree of focus on one specific area that goes far beyond what what expertise achieves. And I think this idea of specialization, ironically, brings with it a general improvement again. And it's like a virtuous circle. So we specialize in one area. We improve our ability and knowledge and understanding in that area. We deepen our knowledge and understanding. And that in turn feeds back to every other element of our playing. And then it becomes self-sustaining. It's like a snowball rolling downhill and getting bigger and bigger under its own momentum. The further you study, the deeper you explore, the more you focus and specialize, the more connections you make with every other aspect of your playing. So if I take myself as an example, around 4 or 5 years ago, I made the decision to specialize on the snare drum as a solo instrument, hence the books and the podcasts and the compositions and things like that. And I think on the one hand, in order to achieve that, I had to compromise. I had to give up things. So I very rarely practice the drum kit these days. I practice it when I have need for jobs and gigs and tours and things like that. But 99% of my actual practicing, dedicated, deliberate practice time, is on the snare drum. Almost all of it learning pieces, actually. And I've spent most of my time studying composition and rhythmic theory and different composers and different compositional techniques. and learning those pieces and writing my own pieces and performing and recording my own pieces and other people's pieces. But this in turn has made me a better drum kit player. I think a far better drum kit player than I would have been otherwise had I carried on in my broad quest to, quote, master the drums. So almost ironically, I am now a better drum kit player because of my specialisation as a snare drum player. Now that again doesn't necessarily mean it's because of a technical aspect. In fact, I would probably be far better technically on the drums than I am now, on the drum kit than I am now, if I'd have carried on practicing as I used to. But technique is arbitrary when you have the understanding. Technique is arbitrary when you have a depth of knowledge and otherwise expertise. You can learn, beyond a certain level, you can learn any given technique or genre in a matter of weeks or months if you know what you're doing, if you know the right resources and you know how to practice and you understand what it is you're trying to learn. Any technique can be learned. Any speed and difficult coordination can be learned like a solution to a puzzle relatively arbitrarily. Whereas the depth of understanding and concept, in my own case now, when I think about the things I teach and the students I work with and the level I'm writing at and the level I'm performing at on the snare drum, that transposes over onto the drum kit because I've got a much deeper level of confidence in my own ability, a much deeper level of confidence in my own knowledge. I understand the nature of phrasing, the nature of compositional elements that I just didn't before because I've never studied those things. So I'm a better drummer because my understanding is better, because my appreciation of compositional and musical elements is better. Not because I've got faster hands or I can suddenly play gospel chops where I couldn't before or anything like that. But as I've said, those things can be acquired relatively arbitrarily when you've got the understanding. And I think mastery also has this degree of dedicated effort pointed in that direction. So in my own pursuit of mastery, for instance, I have spent time actively researching, by which I mean I've got a book open in front of me and I'm reading it and I'm taking notes like I did at university. I'm actively going out of my way to seek out resources to learn from them. I'm actively going out of my way to learn the repertoire of a particular composer in order to better understand their approach, to better understand their characteristics, and likewise learn from that and apply it to my own work. Now, arguably, all of these things happen to experts as well. I think you can be at the very high end of expertise and still do all of these things. So I think the only thing that really differentiates it is time and persistence and the quality of your research and the quality of your studying. And again, I think eventually you realize that you've breached this threshold where anything is attainable. Now, again, I'm not making any claims as to my own attainments. I'm not making any claims as to my own level here. I'm simply making observations on my own path and the path of my students and other people I've been lucky enough to work with. I think the path to mastery is a dedication to an art form. And I think that dedication to the art form goes far beyond the instrument. I think it goes far beyond the act of hitting a drum and encroaches into art. And it encroaches into knowledge and understanding on a very deep, not necessarily an academic level, but an intuitive, familiar level, where mastery is an ease with the instrument. I felt for years like I was fighting the drum kit, and my relationship with it was very love-hate. I thought I loved it, and I had this passionate drive, but I was always fighting it. And my friends and colleagues would always say to me, "You're going to be a great drummer when you can stop fighting the instrument." And I didn't know what that meant at the time. And I think now I do. I feel now I have arrived at such a place where it is a tool and it is a means of expression, and it's not an enemy to be overcome. It is not this beast to be quelled and subdued. It's almost like, I'm getting very philosophical now, but it's like a friend to share it with. This instrument is just a means to express an idea, and it may as well be a pencil on a desk. It doesn't really matter. And when I look at the people out there who I consider to be masters, yes, they are all united by age. I do think mastery is a result of time. I don't think you can realistically describe mastery in young people. You can certainly describe a very high level of expertise in young people, but I think those young people will have started very young and will have had really good tuition and instruction and have this desire for themselves. But I don't think we can talk about mastery in young people. Now, again, I think time and persistence and experience are very important to that. But when you look at, again, these people that I consider to be masters, I see something that goes far beyond their ability. And this is probably the thing I want to close with today. And it is this idea of their contribution. I talked in the divide between students and experts making a contribution, and an earnest contribution that differs from imitation and becomes innovation. Well, when we look at masters of their instrument and masters of their craft, I think we see a career of contribution to that art form. So let's take somebody like Steve Gadd, who I think is an unarguable master of the drum kit. Now, in me saying that, does that mean that I think Steve Gadd is the objectively best drummer in the world? No, it doesn't mean that. And no, I don't think that. There are people that are faster than Steve Gadd. There are people that can play more extreme coordination, or whatever metric we choose to measure somebody's technical ability. There are people out there that are at a higher level than Steve Gadd. But we need only to, A, listen to him play, and B, look at the vast contribution he has made to this art form, to this industry, to this instrument. Steve Gadd's discography is in the thousands. Pages, if you look on his website, pages and pages and pages of albums he's recorded on, tours he's been on, gigs he's played, and musical artists he's collaborated with. When you have somebody of that caliber, with that level of experience behind them, combined with an ease of technical execution, I think Steve Gadd is an expert technician, right? There is nothing that somebody like me, even, with all my focus on technique and these things, there is nothing I could teach Steve Gadd about anything, really. Because he has experienced it all. He has encountered it all. He has studied it all. He has done it all. Again, that doesn't mean he has the fastest hands in the world, right? That doesn't mean he can play a blast beat along to Nile, or he can play like Horatio Hernandez can in a Latin setting or something like that. It doesn't mean that. But it means he's got this ease with the instrument, a deftness of touch, that he can create precisely the sound he wants to create. And therefore, with an ease that is just joyful to watch and listen to, he can contribute to the art form in a way that only he can. Not because it's the best, but we hear it and we go, that's Steve Gadd. And I think that is, again, this ineffable attainment that is so difficult to describe, having this genuine contribution that transcends simply how fast you can hit a drum. So again, take somebody like Bob Becker. There's sadly very, very few, but there are videos out there of Bob playing with Nexus. And there's this wonderful video of him playing Mudra, one of his seminal compositions. Now, Mudra is a work for snare drum with multiple part accompaniment. And it lasts for something like 14 minutes. I'm not sure how long the final piece is, but it's in that region, 12 to 15 minutes. And it has numerous pitched percussion with it. I'm not sure if they're vibraphones or marimbas or xylophones, or I'm not sure if that's interchangeable, but it's almost like a concerto, a snare drum-led concerto. And there's tuned bells, and there's a taiko drum. And when I watch this video of Bob playing Mudra, I see what is, to me, the embodiment of mastery. Because when he's playing the snare drum, he has an ease of performance, right? There is no effort. And he is playing some extremely complex phrases. He is playing some extremely fast rolls and things like this, but with such an ease, no effort whatsoever, that he is working with the sticks and he is working with the snare drum to produce precisely the sounds he wants. So on a technical level, yes, there is a degree of mastery that is obvious when you see it. But beyond that, you have to remember here that this is somebody performing his own piece. So he's at the culmination of his career on this beautiful stage, surrounded by an appreciative audience, performing his own seminal piece that is renowned and is an example of a magnum opus on an art form. He's performing his own piece at that level with such a degree of execution to an appreciative audience in such a way that, a student like me can look at it and just be absolutely floored by it. Now, that doesn't mean that I can't do it, right? Give me a year and I will learn mudra. As I say, learning something on a technical level is arbitrary. But what he's demonstrating there, and it's like when we see Steve Gadd, even now, in his golden years, playing along to 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover or playing Crazy Army or something, or even, hell, just playing a groove, it goes far beyond the simple act of hitting the drum. And you see somebody performing at a transcendent level that combines technical expertise with a depth of understanding and an ease and a confidence and an experience throughout the career, which is why I say we can't realistically describe young people as masters. They have potential, but until you've got that lifetime of participation and contribution, I'm not sure that whatever we call mastery can ever be really achieved. I think mastery combines all of these things. It combines the technical mastery with contribution, with understanding, and with time. So I would encourage anybody with a genuine desire, if not to achieve mastery, then at least to understand it or to witness it, to go and watch Bob Becker playing his rendition of Mudra, and to go and watch Steve Gadd playing, well, anything really, because for the last 40 years, Steve Gadd has been playing at the highest level. And again, I really hasten to add, this doesn't have anything to do with his ability, because we can watch a Dave Weckl solo or a Vinnie Colaiuta solo, and we can point to things that Steve Gadd perhaps can't do or doesn't do or chooses not to do. And I would also hasten to add here that I absolutely consider both of those men as well, Vinnie Colaiuta and Dave Weckl, to be absolute masters of their art form, but in a different way. So I think this is the last thing that I really will close now, because I've been rambling for a long time now. I don't think mastery can lend itself to comparison. I think this is the notion that I will close with today. I've just named 4 names there: Steve Gadd, Bob Becker, Vinnie Colaiuta, and Dave Weckl. And these are 4 players that I believe embody genuine mastery of this instrument and this art form for different reasons. Dave Weckl is very different to Steve Gadd. Bob Becker is very different to Vinnie Colaiuta. And I can talk about who I prefer. I can talk about things that maybe one of them can do better than the others, but I can't in any realistic sense compare them. I can't say, even if I wanted to, I can't say that Vinnie Colaiuta is better than Steve Gadd, because that just doesn't make sense. It's like saying green is better than blue. We can have our favorites, we can have our preferences, and we can even have our context where I would rather have green or I would rather have blue. But to say that green is better than blue is just a nonsensical statement. And I think when you are talking about genuine masters that combine all of those things that I've talked about at great length today, saying one is better than the other is just like saying green is better than blue. So I think it combines all of these things. But anyway, I'm at grave risk of repeating myself ad nauseum today. So I thoroughly hope that this rambling tirade as to the nature of progression and mastery has been somewhat interesting to you all. I'll leave that there for today. But as I've said, if you like what you've heard on this or any other episode, pop along to the website, jonathancurtis.co.uk, say hello, and I'd be more than happy to discuss this at even greater length with you. So thank you very much for listening. And I think we will close with a duet today. This is a piece entitled Hotspur from my Contemporary Marches collection, and it just features the snare drum with bass drum accompaniment. So thank you very much for listening, especially if you got this far. I wish all of you absolute good luck and progress on your own path to mastery, and I hope you enjoy this piece. This is Hotspur for snare drum. Thank you very much. See you next time.